Right, get ready for a deep dive into one of the most, well, I guess you could say haunting cases in American history, the Golden State Killer.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one is, it's dark for sure. This deep dive is going to take us through, gosh, decades of just terror and fear. And we're going to look at the relentless pursuit of justice and the power of, some really cutting-edge forensic science. It's heavy stuff. So if any of this, it's a little too close to home for you guys out there listening, please remember we have support resources linked in the show notes. And today we're really going to be examining this great case file podcast episode. It's titled Case 53, The Golden State Killer, Part 6.
You know, what's really fascinating is he wasn't always known as the Golden State Killer. He went by a few different names. I mean, think about it. He terrorized California under a bunch of different monikers. The Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and the original Night Stalker. It's kind of like he was trying to outrun his own past, you know?
It really is like he was, constantly evolving, becoming more and more brazen with each new identity. So let's start at the very beginning. 1974, Visalia, California. Kind of a peaceful, quiet town where this entire nightmare began.
Yeah, and at first it was just this, unsettling feeling, like there were these burglaries happening, but the thief was taking weird things, like family photos and personal items and stuff. Some people even said they would find their houses messed up, like the faucets were running, doors left open, that kind of thing. It was almost like he wanted to, leave a mark, like a psychological mark to let them know he was there.
Yeah, it's like you said,
Yeah.
it wasn't just about stealing stuff. It was this element of psychological torture.
Right.
Right from the start, it's almost like he was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push things before people would really notice.
Exactly. And then you have the attempted abduction of Beth Snelling,
Yeah.
and then the murder of her father, Claude. I mean, that changed everything. The Visalia Ransacker wasn't just some petty thief anymore. Now he was a killer.
And a killer who was able to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Detective Bill McGowan, he was investigating these crimes early on, and he had this hunch that the Visalia Ransacker might actually be the same person as the East Area Rapist who was terrorizing Northern California. But get this, other agencies didn't even take him seriously at first.
And that's a really important point to bring up, that lack of communication, the fact that they couldn't or just wouldn't share information between all these agencies. That helped the Golden State Killer. He was able to slip through the cracks.
You're absolutely right. It allowed him to keep going for so long. So let's fast forward now to 1976, Northern California. The East Area Rapist emerges. What sets him apart from, say, the Visalia Ransacker, besides the location, I mean?
Well, the level of planning, it's really something else. This wasn't just some crime of opportunity. He was stalking victims, learning their routines, making creepy phone calls late at night. It wasn't just about stealing things, or violence even. This was about control and power.
Yeah, that's what makes it all so scary. It feels so random, like anyone could be the next target.
Well, not exactly random. I mean, he did terrorize a pretty large area, but he seemed to really focus on suburban neighborhoods, places with single-story homes. Those gave him easy access and escape routes. He also preferred areas with a lot of trees and less foot traffic. That way he could move around and not get noticed.
Okay, so maybe not completely random. There was definitely a method to his madness, but still, can you imagine the fear in those communities, living under that shadow? And then there's that Gloria Way double homicide. Brian and Katie Maggiore, shot and killed while they were just out for a walk in the evening. It wasn't exactly the typical MO for the East Area Rapist, right?
Yeah.
But there were some similarities.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They found a navy blue shoelace at the crime scene, and it was tied in a specific way, like a double loop. And that's similar to how he would restrain his victims. So that kind of made everyone wonder. Had the East Area Rapist escalated? Had he started killing people? And, you'll see. That kind of escalation. It's a pattern.
It's chilling to think about. And speaking of chilling, there's another piece of this puzzle that I always find really unsettling. It seems totally unrelated at first. A shoplifting case involving a police officer named Joseph DeAngelo.
Oh, yeah. He got caught trying to steal a hammer and dog repellent.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, come on, that's a weird combo. And the thing is, he was a cop. Stable job, pension, all that. It just didn't add up.
And then he ends up getting fired from the force. It's almost too coincidental, right? The East Area Rapist attacks just stop around the same time that DeAngelo loses his badge.
The timing is definitely suspicious. And after he got fired, he apparently made threats against his old chief and even admitted to going to his house with a gun.
Wow, I didn't know that part. That's just like a peek into his mind,
Yeah, it definitely makes you think. But for now, let's shift gears a bit. The story moves south in 1980, and a new name comes up. the original Night Stalker.
So he goes from ransacking and raping to stalking and killing, and now he's in Southern California. What's the deal?
That's the million-dollar question. And in part 2, we'll talk about
Yeah.
the original Night Stalker and how his crimes got even worse.
So we left off with Joseph DeAngelo, this disgraced ex-cop.
Yeah.
And the original Night Stalker showing up in Southern California, 1980, a new decade,
Yeah.
and like a whole other level of terror.
Yeah, it's scary how he seemed to like adapt, to this new place, this new hunting ground, I guess you could call it. I mean, think about it. The original Night Stalker was going after couples now. Breaking into their houses, he'd tie the guy up and make him watch while he attacked the woman.
God, it's like it's straight out of a horror movie. This level of cruelty, like it was all calculated, and then it gets even worse with the murders of Lyman and Charlene Smith.
Yeah, that was a rough one. The crime scene, it was just brutal. Lyman and Charlene were bludgeoned to death. He used a piece of firewood from their own fireplace. And Charlene, she had been sexually assaulted too. It was, the rage, the violence, it was different from what they'd seen before.
It was like he got off on it.
Yeah.
The pain he was causing.
It's a disturbing thought, but it's something the investigators had to consider. I mean, was this personal? Was there something about the Smiths that set him off?
It almost feels like a message, some dark, twisted message, that he was the one in control, that he could, take lives and get away with it.
And that control, all that planning, that was his thing, The Golden State Killer's MO. He wasn't just attacking randomly, he was hunting. He'd stalk them, learn their routine, then he'd wait for the right time to make his move.
So what happened next? Did investigators get anywhere with the original Night Stalker case?
Well, they had some leads. Thanks to this pathologist, Dr. Peter Smith, he was the one who looked at the Smith murder scene. And he did this thing. He would prepare 2 rape kits, just in case.
Oh, what? 2? Why would he do that?
He was thinking ahead. He thought that maybe someday technology would be good enough that they could use even a tiny bit of DNA to figure out who did it.
And he was right. That second kit was like a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Totally. But back then, DNA tech was brand new. They were still relying on the old ways of doing things, fingerprints, witnesses.
I bet it was frustrating knowing this guy was out there, leaving all this horror behind, but not having the right tools to catch him.
Oh, for sure. People were scared.
Yeah, they must have been terrified.
It was a bad time for Southern California.
So the original Night Stalker is still out there. The investigation's going nowhere. What changed?
Well, in the late 90s, DNA technology started getting better, like way better. They could create DNA profiles from just a little bit of blood or saliva, and that's when they were able to connect the original Night Stalker to the East Area Rapist.
Wait, seriously, the guy who was up in Northern California was the same one killing people in the South.
Yeah.
It's huge.
It changed everything. Now, investigators knew how many crimes this guy was really responsible for, and they gave him a new name, Aaron's. It stands for East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker.
Aaron's. That's creepy, but it fits. But even with this new information, the case stayed cold for years. What finally broke it open?
They started using this new technology, DNA genealogy.
What's that?
It's where they use these DNA databases to find relatives of a suspect, even if the suspect hasn't submitted their own DNA,
Okay, hold on. How does that work? That sounds complicated.
It is complicated, but it's really effective. They basically take the DNA profile of the unknown suspect and upload it to a public genealogy database. And the database looks for people who share a good chunk of DNA with the suspect, which means they're probably related.
So then they can, build a family tree and narrow down the list of suspects.
Exactly. It's like a huge genetic puzzle. And this is what led them to Joseph DeAngelo.
Okay, I got to know more. Tell me how they got to DeAngelo using this DNA genealogy thing.
We'll get into that in part 3. It's a crazy story.
All right, so DNA genealogy, right? This is like next level detective work. It's like straight out of science fiction. But it actually worked, and it solved this case. So how did they use this DNA genealogy to finally get to Joseph DeAngelo?
Well, it all starts with this guy, Paul Holes. He was a cold case investigator, and he'd been obsessed with the Golden State Killer case for years. He really saw the potential of this DNA genealogy thing, and he was able to get a sample of the killer's DNA from one of the crime scenes. You remember that second rape kit that Dr. Smith prepared?
Oh, yeah, totally. Dr. Smith was way ahead of his time.
For sure. So Holes took this DNA profile, and he uploaded it to GED Match. It's a public genealogy website. And then they waited. And after a while, boom, they get a hit. not a direct match, but a distant relative of the Golden State Killer.
So they have a name of the distant relative. How do they go from that to actually finding D'Angelo?
It's a long process, a lot of work. They started building family trees,
Yeah.
tracing back generations, looking for any connection, anyone who might fit what they knew about the Golden State Killer. And they had to be careful. They couldn't tip him off.
Can you imagine the pressure? They're so close.
Oh, yeah, and there were some setbacks. Like at one point, they thought they had him. They called him Mr. X, but the DNA didn't match.
Oh, man, that must have been a huge disappointment.
Yeah, it was a big blow. But they didn't give up. They brought in this genetic genealogist, Barbara Ray Venter, and she went through all the data, looking for anything they might have missed. And she found something.
What'd she find?
An old newspaper article about a shoplifting incident back in 1979. And guess who the shoplifter was?
No way. Joseph James D'Angelo.
Yep, the same disgraced cop from Visalia.
Wow, it's all coming together.
Right. And the more they looked into him, the more things just clicked. When he was fired, his move to Southern California, his description, it all matched.
It's like in those movies where the detectives got all the pictures and clues on a big board, and then they finally see the connection.
Exactly. They finally had their guy. But they needed to be absolutely sure. So they put him under surveillance, followed him, watched his house, hoping to get his DNA without him knowing. And one day, he throws away a tissue.
Seriously, a used tissue.
Sounds crazy, right? But that tissue, it was the key to the whole thing. They took it, ran the tests, and it was a match. Joseph James D'Angelo was the Golden State Killer.
Unbelievable. After all those years, they finally got him. It's amazing what they can do with science these days. So what happened then?
They arrested him at his house in Citrus Heights. He seemed surprised, honestly, more worried about his dinner than, the fact that he was being arrested for all these murders.
That's so strange.
Yeah, it's like he didn't even understand what was happening. But for the victims and their families, it was a huge relief. This nightmare was finally over.
So what happened after the arrest?
The investigation kept going. They found more evidence, tied him to more crimes. They even found a link to this woman named Bonnie. You remember the anger retaliatory rapist thing?
Yeah.
Bonnie was his fiancée. Their relationship wasn't good, a lot of ups and downs. And some people think that D'Angelo's rage, his need to be in control, came from that relationship ending.
So his crimes, they weren't just random acts of violence.
Well, that's what they think. And then, while he was in jail, they had hidden cameras in his cell. And they saw him faking it, acting like he was weak and confused.
He was putting on a show.
Totally. He was trying to manipulate the system, play the victim.
That's just cold. What about the trial?
Well, the survivors and the victims' families, they finally got to face him, to tell their stories, It was really powerful.
I bet.
In the end, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and a bunch of other charges,
Lily.
11 life sentences, no parole.
Wow. So justice was served. But it still makes you wonder, how could someone like him, seemingly normal, do such horrible things?
That's a question a lot of people ask. It's like, what makes someone become a monster?
Yeah, it's scary. And this whole case, it makes you think about the technology, too. I mean, DNA genealogy was amazing. But what about privacy? Do we really want the government having access to all that information?
It's a tough question. We got to find the right balance between catching criminals and protecting people's rights.
Absolutely. Well, that's it for our deep dive into the Golden State Killer case. It's a crazy story, and there's so much more to learn. We encourage you guys to do your own research and think about these ethical questions. We'll see you next time, and until then, stay curious and stay informed.